Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to Strategy Session 1, Show Me the Money. I am Christy Hovanitz. I'm with the Foundation, and I am just here to introduce to you our moderator of our panel and tell you how things will run today. In the back, we have about 5 different handouts if you're interested in picking up the presentations from our panelists. I'd like to introduce our esteemed moderator, Tom Luce, the director of the National Math and Science Institute out of Texas. He will introduce the rest of our panelists. We'll spend about 5 to 7 minutes each with our panelists and have an opportunity to do questions and answers. I also have an evaluation form that I would like to strongly encourage you to fill out regarding this session. After you hear from our panelists, I'll distribute it towards the end of the session. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you all for choosing to come to this panel to discuss the very important topic of incentives. As you heard, we're going to be hearing from each of the panelists, but I also get to say a few words. I am CEO of the National Math and Science Initiative, and our mission is to replicate proven programs that we know work across the country to national scale. As we all know, when you deal with the issues, particularly of math and science, we have quantity issues as well as quality issues. The program we have chosen to replicate, which last academic year, we replicated in 6 states and 67 schools. And in those 6 states, we'll be in 145 schools this academic year. We produced average increase across the schools in the 6 states, a 52% increase in passing scores in advanced placement math, science, and English tests. That's a remarkable achievement in 1 year, but it also shows the power of incentives. Our incentive program is easy to measure. It's easy to quantify. We give incentives to teachers to complete the College Board training to become certified to teach an AP course in math, science, or English. We then reward that teacher for each passing score, not enrollment in the course, not taking the national exam, but if they take the national exam and score a 3, 4, or 5, the teacher gets a bonus for every student who does that. We also give a bonus to the student that we call a mini scholarship. And then we give a bonus to the school in addition. And merely with those incentives and training that those incentives purchase, we're able to produce that kind of increase. It shows the power of incentives, and it also is a way, I would encourage each of you to think about that as a way to start breaking the ice in your states, in your systems, because it's simple to administer, and it enables you to garner a lot of public and private support. Businesses is a very simple system to explain to a business why they would be delighted to write a check to an individual teacher and hand it to the teacher, to write a student to a check to a student. Those are easy. The test, as you all know, of course, would be graded by a third party, the College Board. We get a list of who scored a 3, 4, or 5. The teacher's not grading it. We don't rely upon the grade the student got in the course. So it's easy to administer, but it's driving extraordinary results. And we have 22 states who have agreed to do that. So my mission now is raising additional funding to be able to do that. But I think there's great power in these incentives. You're going to hear a whole lot more about ways in which policy can drive performance. But I think it's good to start with a specific example. And by the way, the reason we chose to implement this program is that this program had been in existence in the state of Texas for 12 years and had produced these kind of results in every school in which it was located. And of course, Florida has had a similar program under the leadership of Governor Bush and John Wynn, who was his Commissioner of Education and is here. John, can you raise your hand? Well, he's probably heard me and he went someplace else. No, there he is. He didn't. I gave him an incentive. I said his salary would continue if he came to hear me speak. So that was an incentive for John to stay and hear me speak. Our first panelist is Eric Hanushek, and I've worked with Rick for years and years. I've been involved in education reform for about 25. I think Rick must have been involved for about 50. And I've worked with him many years. I'm a big fan of his book, which you all should buy. It's out in the lobby. He'll even sign it for you. And he, of course, has been very involved in the school finance issue and how school finance formulas can drive performance. I was reminiscing to myself, I think in 25 years of education reform in Texas, I've seen 3 Texas Supreme Court cases throwing out the school finance system. So I think Rick will be in business for a long time. So without further ado, Rick Hanushek, and I'm not going to give everybody a detailed intro. You can read their bios in the brochure.
Thank you, Tom. I was at lunch listening to Joel Klein complain about the fact that Jeb Bush stole his speech. And now we have Jeb Bush, Joel Klein, and Tom Luce stealing my speech. So I will be here to provide essentially a set of footnotes for each of the talks you've had before, which I think have been exceptional. In gatherings like this, it's a fluid audience. I'm going to give you the conclusions. So when you walk out, you'll at least have got my conclusions, and then I'll fill in a couple details to it. One is the point that was made by the graphics in the little photo session before the lunch that says, it really does matter if our kids learn more. It makes a difference. I'm going to try to fill in the details. Secondly, there is a little part that I'm going to skip over easily because it's so obvious, and that is that our legislatures and courts have not done a good job at designing systems that in fact lead to better achievement of our kids. And I'll give you one quick example about the courts, which have been particularly bad in terms of helping our schools out. And then third, I'm going to talk a little bit about how funding and policies have to be linked together. It doesn't make sense to separate funding discussions from policy discussions because you end up with the bad ideas such as rewarding schools for doing badly and punishing them for doing better. So that's the outline. Let me go quickly over a little detail on why it does matter. What I'm going to talk about is performance-based funding at the end, and it's in the book. My publisher hates it, but I don't really care if I sell books. But what I'm trying to do is sell some ideas that I hope you'll take out. So that's the main objective of this. So we know that from all kinds of experience that parents are right. Knowing more does in fact pay off, and there's ample evidence that labor market returns to knowing more are there. What I want to do is talk a little bit about society for just a minute to really emphasize the points that were made in that little movie at the beginning of lunch. So in this complicated graph, of which most of you can't read it, but what this is are scores on international math tests from PISA, the OECD test. And you see, if you could read it, it would say Hong Kong and Finland at the top, and you would say Brazil and Tunisia and Indonesia at the bottom. And when you got up to that red line, that would be the United States. When you got up to the green line, that would be the OECD average, or the average of the developed countries of the world. And when you got up to the yellow line, it would be Canada. Now, one might say, well, we can't really do what the people in Hong Kong do because those kids work so hard. You know, and the kids in Finland, what else would you do in Finland other than go to school? But when you get down to Canada, that looks a lot like us. And the question is, what would happen if we could do as well as they could? Now, I'm going to show you one little graphic that relates those pictures to the economy. This is a picture that along the horizontal axis is actually test scores on math and science. And on the vertical axis is growth rates of the national economy. Now it says conditional because we know one thing, and that is if you start out at a lower place, it's easier to grow. Because all you have to do is copy what everybody else does. And the more developed you are, the harder it is to grow because you have to invent new things and do things better. But given where countries start out, what this says is that there's almost a straight line between growth of the national economy and performance on those tests that I just gave you. So you have at the bottom South Africa, Peru, and the Philippines. And you get up to the far right-hand corner and you get Singapore and Taiwan. And if you look hard, right in the middle, you'd find USA. This is it's a big deal. So let me illustrate what a big deal it is. So what would happen if, I'm starting in 2005, we started a real reform policy that would bring the United States up to Canada? The previous estimates, or the previous line I gave you with details behind it about growth rates, allow us to project out how much more would the economy grow and how much higher would national income be if we could get up to Canada. Now, it's a little bit complicated because there's green and blue and purple lines. What those just indicate is how long does it take us to get to Canada? Because we can't do it overnight. We can't just say we're going to be Canada and tomorrow we're Canada. We have to change the schools and so forth. So green is 10 years to get to Canada, blue is 20 years, and purple is 30 years. Now, what I've plotted against that, what I've plotted on the vertical axis here is how much larger is gross domestic product in any year because of the additional knowledge of our population. And to give you a benchmark, the red line is a projection of total expenditures on K-12 education. What do you see? Well, you see out there in around 2030, you see that the added income to the U.S. from knowing more equals the total spending on education. Education is free at that point, in the sense that if we can find a way to improve our schools, we can pay for all of our schooling out of the bonus, the growth dividend that we would get. So that's the filling in the details on the picture that we're in international competition. It's not really competition, as you said, because every country in the world can do this. You could have Brazil doing that, or you could have Canada doing it itself. So how do we deal with this? And I want to talk a little bit about legislatures and the courts. I'm going to talk about the courts first. Many people have got the idea, well, the real problem is we just don't spend enough on our schools. And if we could just spend more on our schools to have an adequate funding of our schools, we could, in fact, solve this problem. These are lawsuits that have gone through, cut through every state in this room almost. All but 5 states in the union have had major school finance cases in the last 35 years. Wyoming is an interesting case. Nobody knows Wyoming, right? I mean, it's that little place somewhere in the middle of the country, not many people and so on. Well, they had a court case in the mid-1990s in which the judge said that the schools of Wyoming had to be unsurpassed. They had to be visionary and unsurpassed and spend whatever it takes. All you have to do is tell us, have a vision, and we'll fund it. Well, you can see the bottom line on this chart, this is over time, the bottom line is average U.S. spending adjusted for inflation. And we've been spending a lot more over time. But the top line is Wyoming spending adjusted for inflation and also adjusted for the fact that it's cheap to buy people in Wyoming. And what you see is that where it really takes off is when the court said, do something, you can fund everything. And in fact, if you adjust for cost of living in Wyoming, Wyoming is the top spending state in the nation. So you might say, well, what did you get from that? What do we get from that? Well, here's trends in performance between 1992 and 2007, according to the National Assessment of Education Progress, NAEP. And what I've shown is there are three groups: fourth grade reading, fourth grade math, and eighth grade math. The dashed line is the national growth in each of those subjects between 1992 and 2007. And the red line is how well Wyoming did. So with that previous chart, they actually regressed. If we look at their only minority students in Wyoming, Hispanic students, we might say, well, everything went into eighth grade math, but everything else fell apart. I mean, this is just epitomized, and it makes clearer the problem we've been facing, where we think that we can solve this problem by just throwing more money at the schools. Since 1960, we have over quadrupled or almost quadrupled spending per pupil adjusted for inflation in the United States. And we could put up the national NAEP scores that suggest that our performance in 2007 is virtually identical to that in 1970, with a quadrupling of funding. So the story here is that what do you do about it? So first, you can't separate funding from your policies. Second is this incentive question that Tom brought up, that everybody brought up. If you're interested in achievement, you've got to fund achievement. And you've got to pay attention to achievement when you fund things. And you can't do just little things around the edges. We have ample evidence that doesn't work. So I'm going to quickly go through what I call performance-based funding and lay them out. I'm running out of time, Tom tells me. And this is the arguments that Al Linseth and I make in our book about how to link these together. One, you can't run an education system if you don't know what you're going to do. So you have to have good standards, you have to measure performance, and you have to hold people accountable for their contributions to that performance. Secondly, it is just obvious insanity to try to run school systems out of state capitals, because the local districts, in fact, know what their capacity is and know what their demands are and know how to fit these together. Hold them responsible for outcomes, but let them do what they can, both in terms of making decisions and part of funding. Thirdly, you want to directly reward people who contribute to what you care about, performance. So this includes performance-based pay. It includes ideas of how do you get the incentives right in terms of choice, letting parents get involved in decisions about choosing what districts are doing well, and get them to add to the incentive structure. And it also, I must say, we always get into these questions about teacher pay and teacher performance pay, but you can't have a teacher performance pay without having an administrator performance pay package that is, in fact, coordinated with that, because otherwise administrators work on a different scale than the teachers. Fourth, the question that I don't think I have to talk too much about after lunch is we just have to have a system that has good information, that evaluates our programs, and that has a program of continuous improvement, because what improves things in New York City may not translate very well to Kansas City. And then finally, I put at the end, it's not meant to the end because it's pretty obvious, and that is you have to have rational and equitable funding, where you in fact pay more, put more funds behind kids that in fact are more expensive to educate if they come with disadvantages or special education and so forth. But the reason why I put it last is that often the argument just stops there. Well, if you just paid us more money or more money for our poor kids, we'd do better. But we really have ample evidence that that is not the case. Okay. This is the story of schoolhouses, courthouses, and state houses. And I'll leave it at that.
And although Rick says he's just selling ideas, he'll also sell you his book. It's out in the lobby. I would just add a quick remark. When he says incentives are important, so are disincentives, is what I call them. In Texas, we give schools more money if they keep a student in bilingual education for 12 years. I'd like to give them more money if they graduate a child out of bilingual education. That's an example of what I call a disincentive. So it's important to look at, because incentives do drive behavior. So it's important to keep that in mind. Our next speaker on the list is Vicki Marie. She's Associate Director of Education Studies at the Pacific Research Institute for Public Policy, and she's going to enlighten us further on this subject.
Well, thank you very much, Tom. Now, we talk about disruptive innovation with technology. Sometimes when I get up here and have the computer in front of me, it's just disruptive. So I'm going to pull up there we go. Okay, the title of my presentation is called Show and Tell. What my colleagues at the Pacific Research Institute and I did, along with our partners, the Educational Results Partnership, which is a subsidiary of the California Business Roundtable, was not only did we show people the money, we told them all about it in California. So I'm going to be making references to the California School Finance Center database that we're not going to show up on the screen. I can answer more questions later. But what we did in California isn't exceptional. Anyone can do it in any different state. So there's more detail in my presentation. I won't go through all of it because it is after lunch, and after all, it is school finance. We want to keep everybody awake and alert. So I'm just going to go through some high points. As you can see here from the picture with Jimmy and his friend Fluffy, the point of this slide isn't that school funding is cute and adorable. It's that it's a real handful, it has claws, and it can bite you if you're not careful. That said, you can manage it. What I'm going to talk about, as I said, I'll be referring to examples from our California School Finance database. I'll be talking a little bit about what transparency is, and importantly, what it isn't. And when you talk about transparency, you should include money, but show me the money and what else? What other data you should include in databases to bring full transparency to what's going on in your state. And four, I'm going to talk just briefly, maybe this would be a better subject for Q&A. I can get into more details. Strategies for success, how you build an effective database and sort of strategies for getting it out into the hands of people you want to use it. Essentially what we did in California is we compiled publicly available data from 12 California Department of Education sources, and we put it all in one place. Now you might think, well, for heaven's sakes, if it's already out there, aren't you a little redundant? Well, the problem is that many states of education will go through and they're following various state and federal mandates for making information available. That does not mean it's user-friendly. So if you're a parent or anyone really who has a day job, finding the information you need in a timely, effective manner is going to be very difficult. So simply compiling information and putting it all in one spot is a tremendous help. Also, you should be using a tool that puts pressure to reform, both internally. Our target audiences are not just parents and the public and lawmakers, but also school board members, teachers, district superintendents. One of the data points I'll be talking about is we include staff salaries and revenue over time. So internally, school personnel, teachers, you'd be surprised. Teachers don't know how much their superintendents are making, their colleagues are making. They also don't know how much revenue their schools are getting, particularly when they're being laid off, or at the beginning of the school year, they have to pay for school supplies out of their pockets. So you can imagine the letters I get whenever I do an op-ed, and they say, hey, what do you mean we're getting? That can't possibly be right. I just had to shell out, $500 for chalk and paper. Well, what happens is they start going to their own principals and superintendents and asking important questions, which is very important. But external pressure matters too. Once you make this data available, then all of a sudden lawmakers start calling these superintendents, school board members, and members of the local community start asking tough questions. Now, I'm going to skip through the next two sections. This is detailed information about what we included. I would recommend total revenue, include it for both traditional public schools, but also charter schools. That's going to be very important. And we were able, because of our strategic partnership, to include something called a return on investment function that was developed by the California Business Roundtable. Essentially, it shows you what you're getting in terms of achievement for the dollars that you put in. And the way we present it, excuse me, is imagine two dials, like your car dials, like a fuel gauge. And so ideally what you'd want is it to be low on the money side, so we're kind of in the, on the red, almost empty on the money side, and high on the green side. Unfortunately, in too many cases, you get the opposite. Lots of dollars, not much achievement. So that's a good way for parents and policymakers to see right away how they compare. This is just a simple formula. Compile publicly reported data, present it in a comprehensible way, and report it through a one-stop resource. Namely, you shouldn't have to go through 50 mouse clicks to find total revenue, then go over to 20 more web pages and find out how many students are in the school, then get your abacus out and try and figure out how many students you have and how many dollars you're getting. And that's exactly how a lot of state departments of education report it. So once you make this information available, public school revenue, total per pupil, break it down by source, namely state, local, and federal, what you start seeing is that, once you put all the money together, it's a lot more than people might think, because state departments of education will typically only report general fund revenue, which is about 20% less than the total revenue they're getting, and they cherry pick it. This, by presenting it, give people all the information. You let users decide how they want to use it. So if they want to include capital, exclude it, however you want to use it, you make the decision. I would also recommend doing it over time, because that way you can see trends. So when all of a sudden parents start seeing, wait a minute, how come enrollment is going down, yet I keep getting hit every elective cycle for another bond, more money, then all of a sudden parents and school board members start asking questions. But here's what transparency isn't. There's a lot of information out there, what I call a data dump. And particularly after No Child Left Behind, we have lots of information out there, but it's not in a form that parents or lawmakers can readily assess. So transparency is not a data dump. It has to be usable, but I'd also argue that transparency is not accountability. Three things have to happen before you have accountability. One, information that is accessible, and that's what a database like ours will do. When you report total per pupil amounts, all the money, you don't cherry pick. It also has to be accurate. You may be surprised to learn that a lot of states will release public information about finances. It is not audited. I was shocked when I learned that California publicly releases unaudited financial data. Districts are required to do audits, but our State Department of Education is not required to release that information. So that's something we help promote, is more accuracy, because you can bet your life if there's a mistake and a superintendent sees it, we hear about it, and then we pass it on and correct it on our database. But you do not have true accountability until parents can act on the information in that database, not simply, calling up their school boards. I would say that the way you get schools to improve is when parents have information that they can act on and take their child to another school. So that would be my definition of accountability. Now, with that, I probably am coming toward the end, Tom. I would strongly also recommend that you form strategic partnerships. With us, it was the business community. You can pool talent. They had one of the best web designers I'd ever seen who also got school finance. You could save resources, and you double your networks. We brought networks of parents, teachers, and school board members. They brought the business community. And as a result, we've been in every major paper. The governor now uses our website. We are the go-to source whenever the superintendent or anyone else claims that we don't have enough money. And the thing is, you are not made the bad guy. You don't have to comment on whether you think it's too much or too little. In some cases, it may not be enough. In some cases, it may be too much. You're just presenting publicly available information, and when that happens, opponents of reform no longer can use finance as a political football. You now know exactly how much various reforms will cost, down to the dollar, and all of a sudden opponents have to argue the facts, and it levels the playing field. So I would highly recommend a database, and I'd be happy to answer more questions about it later. Thank you.
What she's talking about really works, and more states are beginning to grapple with that. Texas just passed a law requiring the comptroller to do that. So it's a great trend, but it needs push from everybody in the room. Eric, unfortunately, was last. That probably means he has less amount of time, but I'm going to give him his full allotted time. Eric Osberg with the Fordham Foundation. Eric?
Thank you. So I'm going to tell you a bit about weighted student funding, which is a particular type of funding, and I'll try not to get too into the weeds. I just have about 5 slides here. But we've heard both from Rick and from Vicki about a few things we need in our funding systems. We need them to be rational and equitable. We need them to be transparent and more clear. And we need them to somehow empower local decision makers. So we see weighted student funding is designed to do all of those things. It goes by a number of names. You've probably heard weighted student formula, student-based budgeting, these sorts of things. They're all describing similar sorts of things, but it comes in many flavors. So I think it's important to keep in mind that it has, to us, 5 key principles. First, that funding follows the child. You heard at lunch some complaints about categorical funding and how political that can be. This tries to get away from that and really ensure that you're funding the student, not funding programs or staff positions. The second that's important is that it's, of course, weighted, the idea being that certain students carry more expensive education needs, and you try and account for that in your funding system. The third and fourth principles here really go together, the idea being, as I said, you want to empower school leaders to make decisions in their schools, to customize programs to meet the needs of their students. And you can really only do that if principals have some form of budget control. And they can only have that if they actually are receiving real dollars they can use rather than being assigned staff positions or other resources. And finally, the fifth principle, as I mentioned, is transparency and simplification. The idea being that a school funding system shouldn't be 100 pages of legislative language that only 3 people in a state or a district understand. It should be something readily accessible to the public, to parents, to everybody. And the way the student funding system can accomplish that, in theory, you could boil it down to a few lines or a half a page that anyone could really understand. So this is just a quick hypothetical example of that, admittedly oversimplified, but I think you'll get the idea. You assign each student a base amount of funding, say $4,000. Then you pick some weights. You pick the characteristics that you think are more needy or more sort of worthy or requiring of extra funding by students, such as poverty, their disability status, whether or not they're an English language learner, and there are others. And of course, you set weights for those and provide additional funding accordingly. And then each school's budget, of course, becomes the sum of all those students and the dollars they've carried with them. And as I mentioned, principals then have discretion over how those funds are spent. And so this is designed to, as I mentioned, accomplish a number of things. I think this slide really just scratches the surface on that. But certainly it's designed to correct funding inequities or funding gaps. We've seen those between districts across the country. The Education Trust famously has documented how high poverty and low poverty districts have spending gaps of $2,000 or more per student. And we're increasingly seeing them now within districts. Some of the work of people like Marguerite Rosa, the sort of forensic accounting that sounds like Vicki's doing, when you really dig into district level and sort of school level ledgers and actually understand how the dollars are flowing, you can see that schools that are serving similar types of students can have widely different budgets, and schools that are serving poorer students can be shortchanged. So this is designed to correct that. It's also designed to I think, help us bring school funding into the 21st century. Students are more mobile than ever before, and we have a proliferation of choice options, charter schools, empowerment zones, magnet schools, open enrollment programs. So a funding system where dollars all sort of originate at a district and then are sent out in the form of teachers or whatnot to schools really is not flexible or nimble or modern enough to accommodate that. And finally, it's not on this slide. I mentioned local control. This really just comes straight from Management 101. The idea that those who are closest to the information, closest to the ground, are in the best position to make decisions is common in all other sectors, but we don't fully appreciate it in education. And of course, those people in education are the principals. So they're the ones who need the ability to customize their schools and their programs to meet the unique needs of the kids they're trying to serve. And this is really designed to do that. So there are a number of places that are currently employing some form of wage student funding or another. And I won't profess to be an expert on all the weights or details of all of these places. I would definitely recommend the Wage Student Formula Yearbook by the Reason Foundation that's mentioned up there. It came out earlier this year and is 150 pages or so of detail on how all these places have structured their programs, which is really helpful. I would just say, when you observe from afar, you really see how many different flavors this comes in, because there's so many ways that it can vary, not just in the weights they choose to use or the values they set for those weights, but in how they think about empowering their local leaders, how much control principals get, and how they're supported and trained and whatnot. You see variations in how they account for things like teacher salaries. In most districts in the country, a whole district will sort of budget using an average teacher salary and not really show you the true cost of a teacher workforce at any one school. Which has the effect of having usually high poverty schools with less experienced teachers sort of subsidizing the salary costs of the wealthier schools across the street. So some districts have tried to break through that. Other districts have tried to deal with the challenge of incentives that I think you certainly can see how there's danger in such a system here. If you are, for example, some districts have incorporated academic performance into their systems. And so you want to set that up properly such that you're rewarding schools that are improving their academic performance. And thus, if you decide that, well, it's important to give extra funding to a school that has struggling students who have performed poorly, you want to make sure you're doing that based on their prior test scores, not their sort of future test scores. So these districts have varied in a lot of ways in how they've done this. And finally, since I know a lot of folks here are thinking about things from a state policy perspective, wage student funding, I think, certainly can be done that way. Historically, it really has been done mainly at a district level. But it's not to say it's not possible to think about this in a statewide system, and I certainly would encourage that. It's certainly more complicated, and probably some fresh thinking is needed on this front. I would just suggest a handful of sort of core principles. I do think that state policy could be a little bit prescriptive to districts in requiring transparency about how funds flow from the district to schools. State policies certainly could require that as money goes from the state to the district and to those schools, that it's really following the child, that it's going to the schools and the children that they were intended for. And then I guess I would encourage states to be a little bit less hands-on about local control. I think that at a district level, each district probably needs to wrestle a little bit with how they give autonomy to their principals and school leaders. How much free rein to give them, how much budget control to give them. I would just suggest that state policy could be supportive of that and encourage that sort of decentralization of budget power. So I think I did it within my time limit, and I'm happy to talk in more detail during Q&A.
Thank you very much. I think Eric did a wonderful job. I would just add a couple of comments on Eric's presentation. I worked on the Texas student-weighted school finance formula that we first put in place in 1983. And just a word of warning, at the time, I don't remember how many weights we had, 12, 14, 16. Our school finance system now reads like the tax code. And once you put in a weighted student system, you will find there are as many lobbyists to add clauses to the school finance formula as there are lobbyists to add things to the tax code. We now have incentives about how many miles one school is from another, how far the buses have to run. So you just have to constantly monitor. School finance is never a completed matter. Just add that. Now, let's throw it open for questions. This is a topic that's vital to everybody. You have to follow the money, and if you don't give money right, I like to say money is not irrelevant in education. But if you continue to spend it in the same way, guess what? You're going to get the same results, and that's the bottom line. So how you structure school finance, whether it be at the state level, the district level, the school level, it really does drive conduct. So I'd like to take questions now. You can direct them to any one of us, or you can just throw it open for the panel. But please raise your hand and give us your name, and I'll try to be the traffic cop. Yes, sir, over here.
I think they're recording at times, so they better.
There's a microphone right here. I didn't see that. Thank you, Rick. Right over there in the center, if you don't mind. That way everybody can hear you.
Good afternoon, Tom. Mitchell, Chester, Massachusetts. And I think maybe to Eric and others if they want to, how do we get from here to there? So we're in a time for most of the states, as you pointed out, in fiscal downturn, and not a trivial fiscal downturn. I mean, we're watching in Massachusetts the revenue flow just continue to erode. So you could make the case that that's the perfect time to make the changes, because you can't keep doing what you've been doing. But any guidelines, any notions of how you get from where we are now to a reconstructed system without just simply pulling the rug out from folks?
Well, Mitch, this is better you to answer this than I. This is your regular day job in Massachusetts. I think that the first starting point has already been taken in getting from here to there, and that is that we now have much, much better information on student performance. And it is coming as a shock to a number of parents where their students in their schools stand relative to comparable schools. Providing that better information, I think, gives the impetus to get parents involved. I think it takes creative efforts on the part of states. There is the Florida program that had a bonus pool that would go to districts if they in fact instituted a performance pay system. Texas has a similar one, and other states are doing that. In my view, the unions have systematically not been helpful because they want to keep the existing system, and anything different worries them. They have one part of the argument that I think is correct, and that is we hired 3 million teachers or whatever we have on the basis of a current system and expectations and contracts, and they, in a real sense, have contract rights that go with those, and so you're going to have to buy them out of some of the most egregious parts of the contract. But, for example, in a downturn where there is stimulus money that's going out, some states have used it just to try to perpetuate for 2 more years exactly what they were doing before they lost their state revenues, and to substitute. The alternative would be to try to take your stimulus money and buy out all the old teachers. I mean, just flat buy out all old teachers, because we know on average performance and effectiveness in the classroom doesn't change with experience past the first couple years. And so if you do something like that, all of a sudden you're left with, at the end of the stimulus funds, a cheaper system that you can perhaps manage. Finally, I think that it does involve direct negotiations with the unions. The unions have not, in my opinion, been doing the best by their members. We know we can make your arguments about students, but by their members, because if you look at teacher salaries from 1995 to 2005 that we did in some of the analysis that Al Linseth and I did, and said, what would teacher salaries be if we had the same budget but had the same class sizes and just put more money into the salaries. And salaries are going to be about 30% higher on average if you, in fact, do something like that. Now, the unions have not acted as if that's in their interest, but it is in the interest of the teachers. So it's a series of things: information, pressure, bribes, what have you.
I would just add that, and first of all, I'm sure all of you all know Massachusetts has done a superb job in terms of its standards and its achievement. But I would add to that I think to accomplish all the things I think you all are talking about, we've got to take a couple of more steps on the data side. We really must provide the teacher link to student performance, and we really must back that up to the college preparation program that the teacher came from, because we're going to have to start making some very tough choices about where money is spent. And you cannot do that without actionable information. We referred earlier to data dumps. That's what I call it. We get, an encyclopedia worth of information, but you need actionable information. And so I think data is an inherent part of this, and a very much important part of it.
Could I just add one thing on the data thing, Tom? And that
Sure.
is that some systems are now getting much more sophisticated at providing information that looks like value added of schools and teachers, the additions to learning growth that come from a school or a teacher. If you just have the overall performance, you tend to confuse the wealth of the parents and the family backgrounds with how well the school is doing. And providing that better information is along the lines of what Tom is saying.
It's vital. Second question. Yes, ma'am, if you don't mind standing to the microphone.
Ginger Tenney, professional Oklahoma educators. We're the alternative to the NEA in our state. One of the things that we have found that is a real money hole for a lot of schools, and I haven't heard anybody address this, and would like to see if you guys are onto this, is the legal costs that schools spend when they hire attorneys who drag out cases against the teachers' union. And that is a real cost, and it's a variable cost. Have any of you done any research on that particular issue?
Well, we've done the same anecdotal research that most people have done. I think that the real cost isn't the legal cost, frankly. The real cost is the potential legal costs that stop people from making better decisions on their personnel and their instructional staff. And that the actual legal cost in terms of dollars spent is much too small in some sense. It's outrageous how much it does take to, in fact, remove an ineffective teacher. I mean, a couple $100,000 to remove a teacher who's on coke is outrageous. But if you even tried to get into the effectiveness in the classroom, it's much more.
But let me add, I once made a study of every Texas court case that tried to hold a principal, a superintendent, or a state official liable for in any way in the punishment realm dealing with students, and also in the realm of dealing with teachers. I could find not a single case that had held a school official liable in a matter dealing with student discipline. Not one single court case in the history of Texas jurisprudence. When I said that to a group of school administrators, they said, well, you don't understand. We got a call from a lawyer and said, I'm going to sue you on behalf of Johnny. I said, well, you know what I'd tell that lawyer? Sue me. And I'm a lawyer. I think too often we are afraid to say, no, this is the right thing to do. Second of all, in many instances, the difficulty in dismissing a teacher is when the principal keeps giving a rating to the teacher that says they're outstanding. And we had one experience in Texas. We attempted to put in place a career ladder to reward teachers who were outstanding. And that passed. About 4 years later, I heard an outcry across the state that the state was not, quote, fully funding the career ladder. Well, no, it wasn't, because this is a literal number. 99.4% of the teachers were rated outstanding by their school principal. And so they were all entitled to the bonus. You know what? I don't care what the profession is. There's no profession where 99.4% are outstanding. So part of it is having the courage to really evaluate and really stand your stead in these matters. Next up.
Yes, I'm an attorney as well, Daniel Woodring from Florida. And I wanted to follow up a little bit on something that Eric had said and kind of something that was in the main address we've already heard on the local control issue. And I have a few questions about that. We heard from Joel Klein where he was saying that if you looked at the reform that was out there, he said he was advocating strongly in favor of mayoral control, not of the board control. And speaking as someone who used to have to defend everything that Governor Bush wanted to do in Florida in education reform, I have done a lot with districts and against districts and various other things like that. But what I can say from that history is that in almost every instance that I can remember, the local control, if we're talking school board level, and of course in Florida you have 67 school boards for the entire state. Texas, you have a few more.
1,052.
Exactly. That local control at that level was never helpful in getting to the real reform as far as the accountability or the quality of the teachers or anything else. So I thought maybe you might want to expand on what you are talking about by local control. And the second question is, do you actually have any data that local control in education, if we're talking a school board level, is actually better than, say, having a visionary that directs it from on high?
Mm-hmm. I would comment, and then I'll throw it to Eric. I would say, number one, in my mind, the most important aspect of local control is the principal. I have a coffee cup that says it's the principal, stupid. And to me, that's the essence of local control. School board races, I'll just say in the city of Dallas, you win a school board race if you get 2,000 votes. 2,000. Just stop and think about that. Dallas is a city of 1.5 million people. Eric?
I mean, I completely agree with that. I'm not a huge fan of the usefulness of a lot of school boards. I think, in New York City, for example, when he came in and had mayoral control, he started by yes, sort of centralizing some of his power, but Chancellor Klein has gradually devolved that power to the principal level. Starting with some, I forget the exact term, but some empowerment zones where they had a certain subset of the schools in the city where principals got greater control, and as that worked, they expanded that principal level of power to more and more schools. So, I think that's the right approach. But I think you mentioned accountability. That, accountability should not be at a school-by-school or sort of local level. At a district level, at a state level, at even a national level, we need to set the standards we expect all these schools to live up to and be measuring those externally.
You want to add anything, Rick?
Well, I just add one thing. Daniel, I think what you have to do is distinguish between what functions are properly done at the state level, what functions are properly done at the district level, and what at the school level. And as Eric was just pointing out, one of the obvious things is standards and accountability and data systems, in some sense, are a state function because that's where they're most effectively done. Similarly, providing the funding for disadvantaged or special needs kids is rightfully a state level function because you don't want to encourage movement within the state based upon the extra funding for different characteristics. The thing that goes at the local level is making actual educational decisions, staffing of schools, who you hire, who you keep, what curriculum you use to meet the standards and things like that are, I think, appropriately done at the local level. Where Eric and I actually disagree, and we've talked about this beforehand, is my disagreement with his presentation is about the last 20% of it. The first 80% about deciding needs of students and making that go with them and making it all transparent and so forth is fine. The implicit part of many people, including Eric, who talk about weighted student funding, is that you do away with the superintendents. and that all money goes to the school and all decisions, that you have funding at the school and they make all the decisions, which essentially says do away with districts, which I see little argument that we know how to do that or that we have the capacity to do that. I think that it's fine if some superintendents want to decentralize funding and authority to local districts, as Randy Ward did in Oakland and other places. But you have to remember that we have a system where salaries of people are independent of their performance. Salaries of people are independent of their performance. So that if you say, here's the budget at the school level, and oh, what a bad deal, you got an old teacher. You know, it doesn't say anything about the effectiveness, but you're stuck if you can't change the salary, the contractual arrangements, and if you don't have hiring authority and presumably pay authority at the school level. That's why I'm not a big fan of complete decentralization of funding and bypassing districts.
Vicki, you want to jump in on this debate?
Well, I think you have to be careful when you talk about local control. It's very interesting to see traditional proponents of or opponents of local control become the biggest cheerleaders depending on the debate. I would say that not all local control is equal. I would agree with Rick and Eric that there are appropriate state functions, district functions, and also local functions. But I would just be very careful that we don't romanticize local control. I do favor decentralization. The degree of decentralization, I think, depends on the case. But I would be careful not to romanticize it, and I would really caution people against that. School boards are some of the most, the nastiest debates I've ever seen have been at the school board level. Let's just put it that way. And I've testified before California Education Committee, so I would just watch that. But I think it's important that the control also be commensurate with information. So the more you can release data and get good, accurate information out there, I think it is helpful.
Another question? Yes, sir.
George Bornstead, I'm with American Institutes for Research, and I'm a sociologist by training, so that will show in my question. I was looking at the array of performance, Rick, that you put up from the PISA results, and I was struck where we sat, and I was reminded of another international set of data I looked at, which looked at inequality, where the United States just stands out as having a very, very high degree of inequality. Given what we know about the role of social status in the socialization of our children, to what degree can we really have fundamental change in our educational outcomes in this country without fundamental changes in the issues of inequality? And I include there both income and racism.
Well, I would say in a previous endeavor, I headed a foundation called Just for the Kids, which accumulated data in 40 states on academic performance. And what I would say in response to that question is that I can show you schools that knock the lights out and are performing at the highest level of performance. I'll give you one example. There's an elementary school in Dallas that's part of a federal housing project. The 100% of the parents, or in most instances one parent or a grandparent of the children, are in poverty. And that school, because it had a great principal and it had a great Head Start program that was content oriented, the kids in that elementary school scored on third grade reading, scored as high as 2 of the 4 elementary schools in the richest school district in the state of Texas. So to me, the issue is one of public will. We have proven that despite inequality, despite racism, despite all of these social issues, we have public schools that are achieving at the highest level. And what we don't do is replicate schools that are working. I happen to believe it's for a variety of reasons, including lack of incentives to do so, a mindset that isolates a school, and I've got to find a better analogy, but in many schools, we're like coal miners. They've been mining coal one way for 35 years, and they keep hacking away with the axe, and they get the same amount of coal. So in my mind, it's a matter of public will. And that's not to say that we don't have societal problems in this country, but I can show you in all 40 states, all parts of those states, schools that are just doing a dynamite job. And it's frustrating that we're not doing that in every school, because we know how to do it. Vicki, you want to add anything to that? Rick?
Well, I have one comment. I mean, George, as you know, I have the same concern you do about the achievement gaps in the U.S. I think that's frankly been the strongest part of No Child Left Behind, is to really emphasize and change the dialogue from one of, oh, well, what can we do? We've got these poor kids, to how do we get these poor kids to learn? And so that's been a very important part. What we found on other work on teacher effectiveness and the variations in teacher effectiveness is that individual teachers can have an extraordinary influence on poor kids. So some time ago in a study of Gary, Indiana, all poor black kids, when I looked at the variation in effectiveness across Gary, Indiana teachers, I found that a good teacher was providing one more year of learning per academic year than a bad teacher. So a bad teacher was getting half of a grade level equivalent growth in learning, and a good teacher was getting a year and a half of grade level growth in learning, the difference being one full year of learning. Now the problem is, and that kind of rate of difference clearly closes income gaps without much time. The work we did in Texas suggests that 3 to 5 years of a good teacher versus an average teacher would close the average gap between a free lunch kid and the other kids in Texas. We don't have a system that ensures that everybody has a good teacher several years in a row. In fact, we have a system that does just the opposite. I've heard anecdotal evidence, I don't know if it's true or not, that in many schools, principals look at who the kid had last year and said, oh, you got a good teacher last year, now it's only fair that you get the poor teacher this year. In a situation where it's pretty obvious who are the good and bad teachers in school, but we allow that to persist and just try to equalize it out. So I think that it is will, but it's more than will, it's focusing on what we care about. It's focusing on achievement, rewarding achievement, and providing the means to, in fact, perform well.
Which is another way of saying public will to do what we know works. Vicki?
I
think we better finish up with this, so Vicki and then Eric.
I have to agree. When I'm not doing forensic accounting in California, in my home state, I'm on the board of what is considered one of the country's best, and we've just been named one of the world's best public charter schools, basis charter schools. Our flagship campus is in Tucson, Arizona, which is a very, socioeconomically diverse community. Nobody believed that we could do it. It was a fluke, so we replicated it in Scottsdale, Arizona, which is a very different demographic, very few minorities, very high income. And guess what? We know what needs to be done. This is not rocket science. We get the best teachers. After 1 year, we have merit pay for them. We have a master teacher program. We privately fundraise. And if you're good, you get paid a lot of money. And if you're bad, we fire you. But our kids aren't cherry-picked. These are regular kids. They all take AP starting in 6th grade. So, it can be done. And I think we have to get beyond. Data is important. I don't want to undermine this panel. But at a certain point, come on, how many more regression analyses do we need? We need good teachers, we need freedom, and we need adequate rational funding. There you go, you're done. That's how you fix the education system.
Eric and then Rick.
I guess, one last comment. I guess I would just say from a ways student funding perspective, what I talked about, one of the points of that system is to help figure out ways for poorer schools, for schools that are struggling and serving poorer students, to get better teachers. And if they can't necessarily get all the best teachers, at least get them a little bit larger budgets, they can have more teachers and smaller class sizes. So it's trying to break through some of these problems we're talking about.
Right.
So I'm going to tie back to an earlier question about the legal cost of removing teachers and all of that, but come back to a basic point. We concentrate on performance pay in schools today, and because we're trying to get incentives to keep good teachers and not give incentives to poor teachers to stay around. And we're trying to use incentives to try to get to a better workforce. An almost equivalent system from an economist's point of view is to pay everybody the same but have tougher standards about who gets tenure and who you retain along the way, and that you can do almost the same thing by paying people the same if they pass a hurdle of effectiveness. So let me give you a little data on the distribution of teacher effectiveness as we see it in Texas schools and what it implies for the graph I showed you before from PISA. I did a little mental experiment saying we know the distribution of teacher quality from poorest to best and what a poor teacher does for the kids and what a good teacher does for the kids. And said, well, let's just start at the bottom end and think mentally that if we could just eliminate the bottom 2% of the teachers in terms of their effectiveness, or the bottom 4%, or the bottom 6%, what would that do to the achievement of our schools? And what I found was there's some uncertainty in these estimates. They're all statistical estimates and so forth, so there's a range. But if we could eliminate the bottom 6 to 10% of our teachers and replace them not with a top teacher, but with an average teacher, we could be Canada. The bottom part of our teaching force, by these estimates, is dragging down our schools dramatically. There is no uncertainty when you walk into a school about who those teachers are. I mean, think of what 6 to 10% means. In a school with 30 teachers, we're talking about the bottom 2 or 3 teachers in that school. And when you walk into most schools in the country, there is absolutely no uncertainty. I mean, the principal will tell you, well, those 2 teachers aren't pulling their weight. The other teachers will tell you that. The parents will tell you that. The kids will tell you that. The janitors will tell you that, right? And so there's no uncertainty. But here's where we don't have the will to keep teachers who are harming kids out of the classroom. And there's a big study by McKinsey and Company about why do some countries do better than others, which I wasn't a big fan of because I thought they didn't have a strong enough evidence. But the one part that really resonated with me was a statement that countries that perform well on these PISA International Math and Science tests do not allow a bad teacher to stay in the classroom for very long. But we do. And so that would be my tying back of all of these stories.
Well, I want to thank all of you. I particularly want to thank our panelists for giving us an enlightening discussion, and I want to thank each of you for your interest in being here. Thank you very much.